questions, you should have seen the article on the website and my little quickie contracts song and dance on the website about the difference between one-off and relational contracts. Just for those of you who may be feeling like you've either forgotten all your contracts or never encountered contracts because you're new to that. Anyway, that's just a little, but if you have any questions or anything organizational, let me know or shoot me an email through Canvas, okay? So without further ado, I am super happy to welcome Professor Matt Jennejohn from Brigham Young University Law School, who works on amazing issues about the structure of industries, particularly the pharmaceutical industry. And he's going to talk to us today about disrupting relational contracts. And I need to grab my laptop so I can pull up a copy of the stuff.
No, thank you. Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you.
So I'm delighted to be here, guys. It's great to come from BYU and be with you. This is my first time, I think, in front of you students. I've had a chance to interact a lot with your faculty, which has been one of the great delights of my past 4 years at BYU. So this is my first chance to interact with you guys. So I'm going to give you this slide deck. I know it's a complicated paper, so I'm going to try to walk through things on fundamental levels. I've got some examples that I hope will provide some clarity. If at any time you just want to ask a question, like what exactly is going on, whether it's about the theory or about the data or the market, feel free to raise your hand and just interrupt, and we can address that. Maybe if we want to save sort of the conceptual or the analytical questions to the end, that's fine too. But if you've got a burning question you want to address, we can do it whenever. So I'm just going to start this out sort of to be forthcoming, like why is this paper so complicated? Well, one reason it's really complicated is that the life sciences R&D contracts we're looking at are just complicated. I think so I teach first year contracts. I think the most complicated deal we look at in first year contracts is the Alcoa supply agreement, which you might have, I don't know if that rings a bell. You did that in first year in contracts. These agreements kind of make that look like a bunch of kindergartners wrote that contract, and they're really quite complicated. So that just sort of raises the bar on the whole experience. I should note that Professor Contreras, I think George practiced in this area for quite a while. So he's an amazing resource. He's been really helpful with this project before I've arrived here. It is a little bit like, I was trying to think of the right metaphor. I was thinking that it's kind of like lecturing about mid-18th century English culture with Charles Dickens in the room. So this is sort of my best shot. The other reason this is a sort of a complicated project is it's just using a lot of different literatures. So most contract scholars in the United States sort of work with these two bubbles up here, contract law, obviously, and then over the past 50 years, they've imported a lot of economics into legal theory. So I'd imagine you ran across that a bit in your first year contracts class. What this paper does is it grabs a strategy line of research. So there's a strategy scholar at your business school named Todd Zenger who does a lot of really interesting leading work on this. So it takes some of that work and also some economic sociology and tries to wrap this all up into a single paper. And that takes a lot of doing. So there's a lot of moving parts to the piece, and it's also a big opportunity that the paper is trying to take advantage of. Basically, the blue and the green bubbles are things that most contract scholars haven't really looked at in a sustained way, especially the blue one. And that's the opportunity the paper is trying to grab onto. So it sounds like you got a little bit of an intro already, but we're going to look in this paper, what's the relationship between formal contracts and relational contracts? So formal contracts are the contracts I think you come into law school assuming you know what those are. Those are the written agreements. And when there's a fight about them, and there's a dispute, you take those to a court, and a judge makes a decision, and she writes an opinion, and that's the law. That might interpret a contract provision or whether a contract was formed. And relational contracts are a little bit different. So So what exactly is a relational contract? Sounds like you got a little description already. This is a little bit more involved, right? So the key point here, it's really this last one. Formal agreements are what we think of as contracts, right? There's going to be a formal decision decided in a public court if there's or an arbitration panel if there's a dispute. Informal enforcement or relational contracts are different. They're enforced informally. So if you have a dispute with your partner, it may be over a contract that's never actually sort of written down or agreed to, and it's going to be enforced through these reputational effects or repeated dealings. It's the idea that we're doing deals over and over again, and that's what constrains me as a transactional party from doing bad things to you. So breach is not determined, well, this is argued, but in most cases, the way we think about this, it's not determined by written contract law. It's determined by social norms. What do participants in the market think is appropriate? So these are our two models. It's been around for almost 50 years now, and a burning question is how they work together. But the way I thought I'd illustrate this is with a personal example. This is my hometown. I come from Dousman, Wisconsin, which a couple of years ago broke the 2,000 inhabitant mark in its population. This is Main Street. There are no stoplights. This is the community center where we do the Cub Scout, Pinewood Derby, that sort of thing. It's very small community. It is the home of the Wisconsin State Frog Jump. Yeah, Dousman's built on a swamp, and there's lots of frogs. So every year we do the frog jump in Wisconsin. And just to give you more flavor, this is the Dousman Electric Company, which sort of defies the laws of economic gravity because I don't think they've had a sale since like the 1970s, but they still exist. And this is the post office. And the post office, I had an experience in the post office about 8 years ago that demonstrates informal agreements in a way. So I went to the post office. I haven't lived in Dousman since 1996. I walked into the post office. There was a postal worker at the desk. I had to buy stamps. I walked in there and I said, I need a book of stamps. And I take out my credit card and she says, "How's your daughter, Madeline?" And I thought, creepy. I don't know who you are. And so I told her and we had this long conversation. And I bought my stamps and I walked out the door. And I'm not on Facebook. I just got on Facebook 6 months ago, but I'm not really on Facebook. So I have no idea who this woman was. And I don't know how she knows me. Except I think she recognized that I was a Jennejohn and she knows my mom who lives in town. And it's that sort of community. It's very close-knit. Information travels easily through the community, so easily that she knew about my daughter who she's never met. She's never met me either, but she knows all this because my mom is constantly talking about us in the community. What that means is you can imagine, let's just come back here. So let's say I break down, my car breaks down on Main Street, right? And I need some help. If somebody stopped and I said, "Hey, could I borrow, I don't know, some tools? Could I borrow a jack or something like that?" There's no question that they would give it to me because they knew if I did something shifty, like ran off with their tools, there would be ramifications in town, right? Nobody would trust the Jennejohns anymore. Nobody can trust them right now anyway, but that's it. So that's sort of classic relational contract theory. The idea here is that what's happening at the Dousman post office is what drives a lot of markets. So these famous studies by Ian McNeil and Stuart Macaulay, they said, actually this dynamic, that's how supply agreements are run in major industries. And people have looked at life sciences and said, well, this is a classic case of relational contracting. And this is why people say, look, those written contracts that you look at in first year contracts class, those are really good for commodity sort of one-off exchanges where you can write down in the agreement exactly or closely what the parties are supposed to do, what they're supposed to perform. It's really hard if there's high levels of uncertainty. If there's high levels of uncertainty, it's hard to define in the agreement what each party is supposed to do. So that might be what relational contracts are really great for, right? We don't have to determine what the obligations are. We just have these general norms that say, don't rip me off, right? Behave yourself. That might be what relational contracts are great for. And they might be really important because of this thing that we call, sort of technically, we call it deverticalization. So in the mid-20th century, the classic innovation example would be a large company with an integrated production system. So everything would be produced in-house, like General Motors is a great example. And what's happened over the late 20th century and early 21st century is a lot of production has sort of moved out of companies. I'm sure you've heard of outsourcing, or companies focusing on their core competencies, right? And they're gonna divest interests in business units that are sort of outside of that narrow core. And what's happened, our innovation processes are now governed contractually. So high uncertainty activities like creating new drugs or developing new types of aerospace technology or automobiles, now that's happening across a supply chain instead of within the boundaries of a firm. And that leads us to the key question. Well, how do these two types of contracts interact? If we have a written agreement and we have a relational contract, how do they work together? Because, I mean, there are some markets where people will do everything on a handshake agreement, but most of the time there is going to be a written contract of some form, but there's also going to be this relational contract alongside of it. So this is a complicated slide. This is the background on some theory. So just really briefly, the long-standing idea is, well, they must interfere with each other. And the original research points to this idea like, yeah, maybe formal enforcement of a contractual agreement, of a written contract, that formal contract, that could actually interfere with these social norms. And you can kind of see that. What would happen if I was in Dousman and I stop, I'm broken down on the side of the road, and I say, hey, can I borrow your tools? And this neighbor says, well, let me call my lawyer real quick, right? Or let me pull, here's an agreement on my back pocket. Can you sign on the bottom line first? I'd be like, oh, come on, right? And it might be a signal that, oh, I can't trust this person, or he doesn't feel like he can trust me. So that's sort of this was the way people were thinking about it at maybe 15 years ago, right? These things must interfere with each other. We call it crowding out. Informal enforcement is crowded out when we use formal contract institutions. So to be honest, it's sort of a conservative approach, economic approach. It's kind of saying like, hey, let's get the state out of contract. Let's let this informal enforcement flourish. More recent research says, oh, maybe they work together. Maybe they're complementary. Maybe we can use informal agreements to kind of plug gaps in formal contracts. And sometimes in high uncertainty situations, we need a formal contract that's either going to quote unquote braid or provide quote unquote scaffolding so this relational contract can grow. We're not gonna really dive into those theories that much. If you want to, we can talk about them. But those are the two competing ideas. And what this paper does, guys, is it introduces a third possibility. So the third possibility is now actually maybe the formal contracts don't just support informal enforcement, maybe they actually disrupt it. And it's like, well, that sounds counterintuitive, doesn't it? Doesn't that sound weird? Would you ever call your lawyer and say, hey, I want a contract that's going to bust up my informal relationship? That doesn't seem very intuitive. So here are a couple of limits in the current research. So the first limit is sort of technical. And a lot of the research assumes that the relationships that the people of Dousman have with each other are really thick and interconnected, that everybody knows everybody. So the classic case studies here are like diamond merchants or southern cotton growers or US grain and feed producers, and it's assumed that they all know each other and information flows like instantaneously through the little network. And what we know, though, if we dig a little bit deeper, is actually they're asymmetric, or what we call partially transitive relationships within the network. Some people are very interconnected. We say they have high centrality within the network. Other people are more peripheral, right? So you have your like social butterflies in the middle, and then, I don't know, the antisocial folks on the outside. And that's sort of how these networks are. And what that does is it creates the possibility, of variation, right? So that maybe relational contracting works differently if you're in the center of the network than if you're at the periphery. And the other thing, which is really what the paper works on both of these ideas, but it's really this latter one that's really critical. The other point is that sometimes being deeply embedded in a network is not a good thing. the scholarship we talked about on the previous slide all assumes like more embeddedness, the better. Like the deeper you are in the network, the better it is. Why? Because if the deeper you are in the network, the quicker your information flows within the group. So if your counterparty rips you off, you just start complaining and instantaneously everybody knows you've been wronged and the reputation of your counterparty starts to decrease. So yeah, it's like, deep embeddedness is better. And Brian Uzi, who's a sociologist at Northwestern, says, well, no, wait a minute. Maybe actually there can be a problem with being deeply embedded in the social network. And he calls it the paradox of embeddedness. And his point is, if you're at the very heart of a network, maybe that closes you off from new sources of information. So I'm just to go back to Dousman, right? So Little Dousman is where I grew up. It's great if your car breaks down, right? Everybody's really trusting. It's terrible, I can tell you my personal experience, it's a terrible place to get advice on where to apply to college. Because everybody went to the University of Whitewater. That's the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. It's like the extension, the closest UW extension. If you were really ambitious, you went to Madison. But there's like 2 schools that anybody in Dousman never went to. So as I was asking, like, oh, where should I go to school? Like, I had 2 options. And if you threw out a different name, like, oh, I've got, I saw an advertisement for school X, people would be like, I don't know. Sounds scary. It sounds scary, right? So that's kind of that's the idea. It's this idea that actually maybe deeply embedded is good for some problems, but it's bad for other problems. So this is the argument. Disruption happens because opportunism, which is the problem all the research is focused on, is not the only problem in these R&D contracts. The other problem is what I'm calling technological spillovers, which is I'm trying to grab a bunch of different ideas. But it's basically the idea that when if I do an R&D contract with somebody, I want to be able to capture the value of my investment. Now, an opportunistic counterparty might be one thing that harms my ability to capture that value. They steal value from me, right? But there are other things. There might be our inability to clearly define the intellectual property coming out of the agreement. It's maybe my inability to really control their other R&D projects, for example. It might be my inability to control how the patents are going to be prosecuted out of this relationship. It's those things that I'm also concerned about. And those problems might increase as you get deeper embedded within a network. So if I'm worried that maybe my counterparties, maybe that company's other relationships are going to have an effect on my R&D pipeline, that might increase, that concern might increase as my counterparty and I get more deeply embedded in the network. That means that as we have more and more relationships, right, the spillover risk increases. So what we now have are a couple of testable hypotheses, right? So what these axes show is the amount of formal governance. You might think of this like the amount of formal contracting in a relationship. And then over here on the vertical axis this is the amount of embeddedness in the social network. And traditional relational contract theory says, well, if I have like low levels of social connection, I should have a lot of formal contracting, right? That would be this quadrant. If I have high levels of social connection, I should have low levels of formal contracting. So that's that quadrant. And what the paper here is saying, well, no, actually, we might have sort of a high situation, high social embeddedness with high amounts of contracting, which is puzzling from conventional theory's perspective. So I'm about to get into the the uber technical stuff, the super technical stuff. Just before I get on that, any questions on the setup so far? All right, there's a lot of moving parts to this, but okay, so then it's like, well, let's test the hypotheses, right? What do we see? So the data that was collected from a number of places. So we're looking at a couple of things. first are these characteristics of these life sciences R&D contracts. And those were all taken from, basically from the SEC, right? So companies will have to disclose material contracts to the markets if they're publicly traded under the securities laws. The SEC has a huge database called Edgar with all those contracts. It's really difficult to navigate and use. So Bloomberg and Westlaw and Lexis, they've all taken the Edgar database and they now host it on their platform. So I use Bloomberg Law for this, and we basically sampled over 600 contracts, and due to missing data and whatnot, we ended up with a sample of a little over 500 agreements. And we as in my team of 4 RAs, sort of chopped those up and hand-coded those. So we set up a spreadsheet, and we just captured when those contracts had certain provisions and certain qualities of those provisions. Then we said, well, what's the social network that the companies fall in? And to get that data, we went to a database that used to be called Recap. It's now called Ortelic. It's been sold a number of times. And SDC Platinum, and we just took all of that data and we dumped it into a huge database. And it's tens of thousands of contractual relationships over about a 14-year period in the life sciences market. And then we got some data on the parties themselves. We went to databases like Capital IQ or Privco. We also sort of crawled through some SEC filings again. And this is where all the data came from. So there's a lot of hand collection is what we call it. Lots of summer RA time pulling together data. And we looked at, originally it was 3 dependent variables. In the current version of the draft, I've dropped this last one because it was just getting too complicated to follow. So we're really just looking at one thing, a governance committee. We'll give you an example in a second what that is. And we coded the contracts if it had at least one committee. And then we also coded them if they had multiple committees. And in short, a governance committee, usually, there's different flavors. Usually it has an equal number of representatives from both parties sitting on it, and it's bound often by a unanimity rule. So if we're going to make a decision, for example, to go forward with the next stage in the collaboration, everybody on the governance committee has to be, unanimously on board. And sometimes they'll break them up into like subcommittees. So let's look at an example of that. So for the first way to look at the dependent variable, we just asked ourselves, was there at least one committee, one sort of general governing committee? And that would be in this agreement, this is a GlaxoSmithKline and Anacor contract, one research committee that sort of sits over the whole thing, but they've also broken out a couple of subcommittees. So this contract would be coded as having both a single committee, but also it does have multiple committees. And one way to understand it is roughly by like the type of problem that the committees address, right? So intellectual property issues, so that might be patent prosecution or defending against third-party infringement, that'll be addressed in the patent subcommittee. And if that committee can't make a decision unanimously, the issue will get kicked up to the Joint Research Committee, where they deal with the same thing. If they can't make a decision unanimously, in this contract, the executive officers get involved, and then there's this trifurcated dispute resolution process. And intellectual property claims are often carved out from arbitration. They go to federal court. Usually, I believe, George, is because you want injunctive relief quickly, which you can get in private arbitration, but from what I understand, federal court is sort of the preferred venue for that. So that's our dependent variable. We're asking ourselves, do the agreements have that sort of governance system in them or not? We also looked if there was a convenience termination provision, but like I said, I've moved that to a separate paper. So then we have to pick some variables that affect whether or not those governance committees appear. And the ones that we're interested in are these measures of social capital, right? High social capital, think of like Dousman, right? Like a lot of like really tightly connected people where information flows easily. So there's 2 ways that I measure that. The first is what we call repeated deals. That just means the parties have had a contract before the agreement we're looking at. That might mean, they know each other, right? They might have some trust built up. The other way to measure it is their position within the industry network. Maybe they're a central player, maybe they're on the periphery. So what we're going to do is we're going to analyze the correlation between the parties, those two measures, and the incidence of a governance committee. And we're going to control for these two categories. We're going to control for certain types of exchange hazards. And I don't want to drive you guys insane with how complicated this gets. But we're concerned about different types of risks. One is an opportunism risk. That's the likelihood that our counterparty is going to do something shifty to us, basically after the fact, to hold us up and take more of the value to them. The other possibility are those spillover problems I talked about. That's the second type of exchange hazard. And the way we measure that here is if foreground intellectual property is jointly owned. And the third type is just coordination or project management problems. So we measure that depending on how involved, or how intertwined the relationships are between the parties under the contract. And then we also control for a difference in bargaining power between the parties. We control for whether there's an equity stake taken in the agreement. So you can govern these R&D relationships entirely through a contract, or you can also, the financing company will sometimes acquire an equity stake in the R&D company. And that's an alternative form of governance, right? Maybe you get a board member for that. Maybe you get some additional visibility. We control for the size of the financing company. Any ideas why in the world we would do that? So it was suggested to me, it's actually over this last summer, I was at a conference with Kathy. And the suggestion was, well, maybe large companies have sort of standardized approaches to how these contracts are designed. Maybe if you're Pfizer, you always demand a governance committee. And the argument, or at least the assumption, it's really hard to measure that without getting into these companies and asking about their policies. But the rough assumption here is that the larger the company, the more revenues the company has, presumably the more likely it is that they would standardize their processes. And we also look at the financial health of the R&D company. If you're a really healthy R&D company, maybe your counterparty is less concerned. But if you're struggling financially, maybe they're going to want to have some more governance options, right? Maybe they're going to want a committee to keep a closer eye on you. So we measure that by taking the EBITDA figure for the R&D company in the prior year to when the contract was executed. And then there's this other thing, which is, well, maybe this is a standardized type of term that the external law firms want. Maybe these firms are repeat players in the market, and they say, this is just what they do. Like, we always put in a governance committee. So we see this in other markets quite frequently, and we're gonna control for that here also. So, my friends, that's what the industry network looks like. So that's about 8,500 companies. This is over a 15-year period about. They have 33,000 relationships. That's if they have an R&D relationship, but it also includes any license or manufacturing relationship they might have. So here are your central players, right? So these are the Genentechs, the Pfizers, the Mercks of the world. And then out here on the periphery, I mean, some of the peripheral players are quite connected. The network picture is just generated by an algorithm. But here's your periphery. So these are usually people that are companies that are less connected. Leslie?
Could you just tell us a little bit about how you defined a biopharmaceutical?
Yeah.
How you define that universe?
So the way I did it was we looked at everything in the SIC code, the standard industry classification code. I think is what it stands for. It's a code generated by the US government that's used by a number of agencies. And 2834 sort of covers this industry. There's a couple of adjacent SIC codes that also arguably cover biopharma. And this is the one that I focused on. It's had the most of them. So that's it. So what is that? That's sort of self-reported, self-identified. So if you're a biopharmaceutical company, that was mischaracterized, you'd be out of the sample. Yeah, but that one's this is kind of getting ahead of myself. So, George, I think one of your previous comments on the paper was, could we look at the relationship between pharmaceutical and biotech contracts, or biotech contracts? And yeah, my and my RA's ability to really determine you're a pharmaceutical company and you're a biotech company it's a little tricky. I know some economists do this very rough approach where they say any company that was established after the late 1970s, they're just saying is a biotech, even if it's small or large molecule, doesn't matter. And everything before that is a pharmaceutical company, which doesn't seem right to me either.
So just in really common language, these are companies that make drugs, that develop drugs.
Yeah. So, so one way to think about it is a pharmaceutical, quote unquote, pharmaceutical company, which has historically been doing what you consider small molecule pharmaceutical development, will often finance the R&D work of a smaller biotech company that has some new technology, right? They've got a new approach, they've got new molecules, and we're going to collaborate in that development. So a classic example is like Pfizer. Pfizer's a behemoth, right? Pfizer can't develop drugs quickly enough to meet, basically meet market demands for profitability. So it'll join with a biotech to try to work together to develop that new drug.
So would larger companies that do have those capabilities still be deemed biotech, or would it more be their subsidiaries just take the title?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So we folded all the subsidiaries up to the parents in this. So yeah, so it might be like a Pfizer sub that falls within 2834 and had the contractual relationship that brought it into our sample. And then when we calculated everybody's position within the network, we folded up all those Pfizer subs up into the Pfizer parent. So we don't have like Pfizer sub 1 here and Pfizer sub 2 here. It's all just brought up into the parent company, if that makes sense. That's a great question. George, did you?
No, I mean, the reason I asked was just to give the students a sense. There's so many players here.
Yeah.
In the biopharma space.
Yeah, it's a massive market. I mean, the one thing that doesn't show up in this is venture capital, right? So another way that biotech companies, if you're thinking of this as like a biotech company and you're asking yourself, how the heck do we get money to finance this operation? One way is to go to the industry network, find a financing company, like a big pharmaceutical company, and say, hey, let's do a collaboration. You give us some money, we'll develop this new technology. The other way is you go to the venture capital market and you have a similar conversation, but there's less, they're not going to collaborate with you in a technical sense. And the VCs are not included in this network picture because it's really difficult to get data. Yeah.
And are universities included as nodes?
No, we backed out because they do show up in the contracts, but we backed those out. We backed out those ingredients entirely. We just took out any of the collaboration agreements, including a public entity, which is a big. I mean, I just felt that's sort of a next step sort of project to look at university involvement.
That's a great project.
Yeah. I mean, I think just to give you the 30 seconds on that. So a lot of the biotech companies have relationships with research universities because the players are the same, right? You'll have professors also leading the biotech. So you get clusters usually built around a research university in the United States. The main clusters are like San Diego, the Bay Area, Boston is a huge one, New Jersey, Austin, things like that. So universities play a really key role here in the ecosystem. And here we've just we've removed the public deals, the public institution deals out of the sample. So these are just the results, and this is, you're like, oh my gosh, what the heck does this mean? And so these are regression results, and all they tell us is whether the correlation between our variables, which are listed here on the left-hand column, whether the correlations with our dependent variable, which is the existence of a governance committee, is statistically significant. So the coefficients are these numbers here, and that tells us the relationship. So if they're, let's use an example that I can actually reach with my hands. So here's a good one, right? So if the R&D company, so the biotech companies' EBITDA figures are going up, right? So that's sort of an indication of financial health. Then the likelihood of a governance committee, it goes down. This is the negative value here. It tells us it's a negative relationship. And it's actually statistically significant at the 5% level, but it's a really, really small effect. So what we really care about is what's in the box. Those are our two figures that capture prior deals, captures our repeated dealing variable, obviously, right? What does that tell us? That says if deals repeat, that there's a positive relationship between repeated deals and the existence of a governance committee, but it's not statistically significant. It means we can't really say it's any different than some random allocation. And this is what's really interesting. So eigenvector centrality, which is this technical term for how central a party is in the network, if you're more central in the network, and what eigenvector centrality does is it also includes your neighborhood. So if you're more central and all your first degree relationships, if they're more central, then there's a positive correlation between that increased centrality measure and the existence of a governance committee. And that's statistically significant. So what does that tell us? Just to go back on the slides, it's like that seems consistent with this idea, right? So what we've done, I would say it's just me and my RAs. And we've controlled for these other things. So we controlled for these different exchange houses. You'll notice that a lot of those are statistically significant also. So there's more to the story. But by controlling for everything, we still find this statistically significant relationship. And then we do something that's quite technical, but even more compelling. We then we treat centrality as what we call it as an instrument, and we interact it with our exchange hazards. And you're like, well, what? What does that mean? Essentially, what we do is we take our exchange hazards, and I'm just going to look at joint foreground IP, and we ask ourselves, what's the correlation if we interact the existence of jointly owned foreground intellectual property and higher centrality? What happens if we compare the contracts where there is jointly owned foreground intellectual property, and what if we look at the contracts where there is not jointly owned foreground intellectual property? What's the relationship between centrality and governance committee in those two camps? And if we find a significant difference between camp one that has jointly owned foreground IP versus the camp that does not have jointly owned foreground IP, that tells us something even more. And what we see is, yes, if you're a contract where jointly owned, or where foreground IP is jointly owned, you are more likely to have a governance committee. If you're also a high centrality pairing of collaborators. It's not the most intuitive statistical technique. But what it tells us is there's actually a relationship between this spillover risk and centrality. I know that's kind of technical, but that's the most. The interaction effects are sort of, statistically speaking, at least the most sort of compelling evidence that we have that there is really a relationship. Yes.
I have two questions. So first is how many, I might have just missed this, but how many firms are there individually? Like, did you, like, were 100? And
Well,
they're heavily networked?
in the
100,000?
So I think there's probably a couple ways to answer this.
Yes.
So in the whole network, which we just used to figure out what structural social capital is, there's about 8,500 firms, individual firms in there. Now, of the 510 alliance agreements that we looked at, there's going to be, off the top of my head, probably 1,200 companies. A handful of them, I want to say 10%, had more than 2 firms that were alliance partners.
Okay. And did your joint venture database also have non-public deals? So does your hairball get more dense if we put in?
No, I mean, it's a little bit more complicated than no. So if it's two private companies collaborating, they don't have any SEC reporting obligations. So the only way it ends up in this is, so Recap and SEC Platinum, I mean, they do have efforts just to sort of comb the industry. Like they literally just have staffers doing this. And those firms may also self-report to them.
Okay.
So there might be some of that. The other way this happens is these two private parties have an alliance agreement. 3, 4, I don't know, 5 years later, somebody has an M&A deal or an IPO or something, and suddenly the previously undisclosed contracts are now disclosed through the SEC, and that's how we get them. So there is a little bit there is some private stuff in here.
But it's not systematically picked up.
No. So this is a problem with this whole area of research. So there is a line in the paper where I repeat what Josh Lerner at Harvard said, which is, what we might be missing are like more peripheral players, right? There might be more parties out on the periphery that we don't know about, with even weaker financial health. So yeah, it might bias the results. George?
So can you go up a couple slides to where you do the, and one more.
This way?
No, advance, farther, one more.
Yes.
This one. Right.
Yes.
So, joint foreground IP and centrality, right? There's a relationship between this and sort of centrality and governance committee incidents. And so, you know, you may be theorizing about why that is in a few minutes. I don't want to jump ahead, but one thing that strikes me as also linking something like joint foreground and governance committee incidents would simply be the number of words in the contract, right? I mean, those are features of more detailed negotiated deals.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm just wondering, do you have a field in there just for word count of the agreements?
No.
Because I mean, my intuition is that there are some, you'll find correlations based more on word count than anything else, right? These are the templates that come from, particular companies, particular firms, or particular types of deals, where you would have both sorts of things, like a governance committee and, jointly owned foreground.
Yeah, well, that would be a different way to get at it. I mean, the reason I didn't is on the assumption that these do tend to be. So there's certainly variety among them, but they tend to be. Well, I'll put it this way: I don't find a lot of 10-pagers. You know what I mean? Like they're mostly quite large. I mean, north of 100 pages, that sort of thing. But that's an interesting thought. There is. I mean, I guess I should just go back to. So if you look at the way we measured the law firms' standardization measures, we looked at there's two firms in the sample that stand out, and that's Cooley and WilmerHale. I mean, sort of head and shoulders above all the others. So we said, well, what if we just code the contracts according to those two? Do we see some sort of relationship? And it's like, yes, if you're a Cooley or a WilmerHale contract, you're more likely to have a governance committee, which suggests there's some standardization there.
That's just because I wrote those WilmerHale contracts.
That's right. Now, the point is, we control for that, and we still get a statistically significant relationship on the centrality measure. But yeah, no, the word count thing would be interesting.
So this doesn't include materials transfer agreements and
not the dependent variable. No.
Okay.
Yeah. The network, that big hairball you guys were looking at, that would include anything like any contract.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a queue. Let's just go in order. We'll just go down the line.
My question is actually related to the top two firm variable there.
Okay.
So that is your biggest efficient, I guess you joint foreground IP
Yeah.
comes in a little
It's close.
higher
yeah.
than that. My first question is, have you guys run it just dropping out those two firms and looking whether the relationship holds across other deals handled by other firms or not handled by
Oh,
firms?
yes. I don't know. So the reason we just looked at the top two also is because the data is so sporadic. The only way we get any visibility on which firms we're advising on the deals is if they include in the notice provisions of the contract the external firm's names, right? So if they don't do that, they might not do that for all sorts of reasons. We don't have that visibility. So we have run it without Cooley and Wilmer. We don't see the relationship, but I'm very hesitant to say that means anything, just because the data is so spotty.
Okay. Oh, got it. All right. You have data quality issues on that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then my other question is, and I'll say that I am very warm to using logistic regression, even on your dependent variable binary, right?
Yeah.
Because it has interpretability benefits, right? But
Right.
Can you talk a little bit? Have you guys run it with like a logit or a probit or something that is, kind of more standard?
And highly similar results. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, for everybody who's really technically interested, so data for these variables was also quite spotty, and I used multiple imputation to basically simulate and sort of complete the data set there, because here the missing data is quite random. On the top two the law firm data, I'm not that comfortable saying, oh yeah, we're missing data on a random basis to allow multiple imputation. So that's, yeah. Thanks. Did you? Yeah.
Right, on the graph, is there any significance to the well-connected points that are on the periphery?
Oh, yeah, so this is just, like I said, it's generated by the algorithm.
Mhm.
I think it's basically just, so this point, for example, it's got quite a number of edges going off to it. I think that's just a relationship, it's just driven by the position of the other nodes to which it's connected to, right? So basically what you get here, essentially what this says is this is a company that has a lot of connections to quite non-central companies, right? That's why you kind of come out here to basically get that spread, because your relationships are going all over the network. Rather than, if you're in here, presumably you have a lot of relationships that are deeper. That makes sense?
Mhm.
Yeah. But I mean, to be perfectly clear, what happens is so let's say I get in my data set and I take out 5 companies. This will get regenerated and it'll be slightly different every time. So, yeah. Was there another question in the back corner? No? Okay.
So one of the things that strikes me when talking about the reason for formal contracting despite embeddedness, particularly in pharma and IP kind of contexts, is the amount of regulatory compliance that these firms have to. So I was just wondering, I recognize that it's hard to kind of control for that in one industry because they're all probably bound by the same regulations. But if you have plans to look at other industries and see whether the pattern
That'd be really interesting. So yes. So here's the thing. Looking at other industries, shy of I'd say like a 5-year data collection exercise, it's going to have to be a qualitative study. Just because I'm looking at life sciences primarily because the data is available. So let's say we go to aerospace, for example. Well, aerospace is highly regulated. Put in a different way. Anyway, we go to a different industry, and suddenly you just can't get this level of data. Software, for example, the software network that I can pull together using these sources is numbers in the hundreds of firms. To give you so that's the big limitation. Now, to actually get to your point, what about regulatory? So we do try to capture that. Let's just look at it. We'll look at it on the regression. So multistage. If you look at the second variable from the top, multistage, what that typically, not always, what it typically means is that we're going to develop this, or well, there's going to be a research element, a development element, and then a commercialization. And that's typically, probably in 90% of the cases in the sample, that's going to mean there's a regulatory process involved. So that we could pull that out, actually, because it's easy in the contracts to see, yes, we're anticipating a regulatory.
Right.
Yeah. So that's a good point. Yeah, thanks for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Can I ask you just a quick point about the next slide,
Yes.
and then let you go on? So I just want to translate that.
Yeah, it's hard.
Joint foreground IP means that the company has joint interest in the intellectual property involved in this transaction.
Yes.
Okay.
So
They're both going to own the drug they're developing or something like that.
yeah, it usually so let's say you and I are collaborating.
Mhm.
Let's say you're the R&D biotech, I'm the financing pharma,
Mhm.
and we're both going to license in whatever background IP is relevant. And as we work together, hopefully we're going to produce some foreground intellectual property.
Right.
Now we're going to have some ownership provisions that might say something like, okay, Leslie, if the foreground IP relates primarily to your background IP, then you own it entirely. If it relates primarily to my background IP, then I'm going to own it entirely. If it relates to both of our background IP, or there's other ways to do this, like if you're scientist development or mine. If it's going to be that combination, then we're going to jointly own it. And what that does is am I right, George? Like usually people say avoid joint ownership if you can, right? Because it's a mess.
Yeah, exactly. It's more complicated for enforcement, for prosecution, for antitrust purposes, so you do try to avoid it.
Yeah.
And the reason people get really worried by centrality is if I'm Pfizer, I'm doing deals with 10 other companies, and one of the companies where we've got IP together with Pfizer is worried that some of the other companies that Pfizer is doing deals with may be able to take advantage in some way that the IP in this deal leaks over.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add is there doesn't have to be any sort of opportunism involved.
Right.
It's not like, oh, we're going to take Jennejohn's IP and we're going to use it over here like on purpose. It's just we're developing stuff over here. It might relate to this jointly owned IP. You might very innocently be developing that, and I'm just concerned that I just want to make sure I can control it as much as I can. Yeah, that's the intuition. I don't know. I've talked to people in the industry. I don't, the findings. It's not the sort of finding where I've had anybody say, yes, that's exactly what's on our minds, right? We're deeply. It's more of like sort of explains, sort of like just I guess the ambient motivations that are driving people. Give or take, we're going to want a governance committee more often in this sort of situation. Are there other questions? Yeah.
So if you would flip back one table, please.
Yep.
So you use prior deals as a measure of social capital, essentially, right? And so these are formal contracts, prior formal contracts between these two companies?
Yes.
And so it's essentially using the formal contract as a proxy for the social capital that gets built.
Yes.
And pardon that I haven't read the paper.
Oh, no.
Is there a path-dependent issue here where once I have a formal deal and a governance committee once, I'm going to do it again? And I understand that's not what prior deals is capturing. It's not governance committees per se. I mean, not necessarily, right? They may be in that prior contract.
Right.
Have you ever looked at just the first deal between, right? Because then there's no path dependence, and then it's all about, you and I are a dyad, we interact for the first time, and so it's just all the soup around us instead of what the law firm made us do the first time, and so they just make us do it again.
Yeah. That's my next, one of my next projects on this is to actually do more of like like I guess you could sort of roughly call it a longitudinal study. Like let's look at, it's really going to look at a single, probably a single large pharma, and what happens over the years as it initiates that first, the first agreement, and then what happens subsequently. There is, just to sort of answer your question with different research, Kyle Meyer at USC has got a paper where he's looking at the statement of work terms in IT outsourcing agreements. And what he finds is over time they get more elaborate. So it's like, which is also counterintuitive from like traditional relational contracting, right? You would think like as our deals repeat, we should be cutting more out of the contract as we trust each other more. But what he finds is as we go, it actually gets more elaborate. And his argument is it's just a learning effect. Like we've learned what our problems are, and we drop it in the agreement. So that would be one of the subsequent projects to see how that works. This is, in a way, this is a very static approach. It just takes this whole network over this 15-year period, and we say, well, what are the relationships we find there? A more dynamic approach would be to kind of trace this over time. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yes?
I'm sorry, this is a stupid question, but
No.
for the different columns, are they just different trials, or?
Oh, so what we do, the different columns represent when we add additional variables. So what it kind of shows you is what happens if we just have these hazard variables. Those are the relationships. Okay, then what happens if we add law firms and prior deals and centrality? And then what happens if we add this is the full range of variables. What are the relationships we
It
see?
seems like in situations in which, like task interdependency, for example, when for the first two trials you get a statistical significance even to the 1% t-test,
Yeah,
and then suddenly you go to the third trial and
yeah.
it starts raising questions of why was it so significant beforehand but not now.
Yeah, I mean, presumably one of these variables explains the relationship better, right? Presumably that's what that means. What we'd be really concerned about is if, as we add variables, if we see, well, I'll say it this way, when we finally get the full model and it's specified and we look at our two explanatory variables of interest, I think that's the main takeaway, and those are consistent between the two models. So yeah, that's a great question. And yeah,
the pool that you're pulling the agreements from, you said you got them like Bloomberg, and it's like a government. So there's some 600 agreements. What years do those span? Is it like 1990 to 2000? Or?
No, it's I fiddled with this a bit, and it's in the paper, but I believe it's 2000 to 2016 or
Okay.
2015 maybe.
I was just thinking it'd be
Yeah.
interesting to do this again in 5 years and see how those numbers change and kind of project what's happening in the industry.
Yeah. So I can tell you on a really big time span. So I pulled what I think is like the I can't remember what's the word for this. It's like the original agreement. It was this Eli Lilly Genentech agreement from 1978, I think. Does that sound right, George? Does that sound? Apparently, this is like the first alliance, first R&D alliance, right? And yeah, if you look at that compared to what's in the sample, there are dramatic differences. Like the lawyers have definitely developed new mechanisms over time. To control for what you're talking about, it's actually, I didn't put it in this one, but I controlled for a year, we call it year fixed effects. So just looking within years, basically it's a way to just shortly to control for that concern. Because one concern might be, well, maybe just over time, maybe the 2010 agreements are just dramatically, systematically different from the 2000 ones. So I tried to control for that too.
Do you have more slides?
I've got one more, guys.
Okay.
And then so this is just the implications. What does this mean? Like, who cares, right? I always get law professors, they want implications, normative implications. And the way I decided to take this is at a very high level, right? So when we think of market infrastructure, we often think of it, I think, as either economists or legal academics, in a very static sense. Like, we want lines on the highway that are absolute. And I think that's the way a lot of our our commentary is driven. We want sort of the one rule to rule them all, right? And what this suggests is really we need contingent, what I call contingent infrastructure. And what does that mean? The big takeaway from the paper is simply that there's a trade-off between different exchange hazards. Sometimes these spillover problems are so important that I'm going to put a governance committee in my contract. Governance committees are expensive in the sense that they provide both parties with a veto opportunity. Presumably they're expensive. So at other times, I'm not that concerned about spillovers. I'm not going to bother with this governance committee. All I'm really concerned about is opportunism, and I'm going to design my contract that way. So the idea is that the relationship between formal and informal contracts is it's contingent. It depends on this mix of exchange hazards. And what the paper is just trying to do is, in a very simple way, take a handful of exchange hazards and identify when parties flip one way or the other in that relationship. But what that means is we can't sort of take these absolute positions like formal contracts always interfere with informal contracts, or formal contracts always support informal contracts. No, it always depends on the context. And what the paper's trying to do is just map what that context, how that context affects the design. And it's a different way of thinking about market infrastructure. What it means is we have to ask ourselves, well, it's really the question of how do we reduce costs for recombining institutions over time, right? We don't want the single answer. We want to have like a portfolio or a collection of answers, and we want to reduce the cost for parties to select the answer they need in that given situation. There's actually a large strategy literature about this, about how companies do this. All right, so the question is, how does an established company continually renew itself and innovate and not become a victim to Clayton Christensen's innovator's dilemma? So there's a literature about ambidextrous organizations and how they manage this recombination activity. And all this is doing is sort of saying, let's extend that to public or quasi-public institutions. So that's it, my friends. Thank you. And yeah.
So with a descriptive study like this, or an analytical study like this, how do you draw a conclusion about what's effective governance or not? Right? What is it simply frequency at which the patterns appear, that is sort of market validation of the model, or like from this set of data?
Yep.
I'm trying to understand if you can draw any conclusion about what was effective or what was successful. You can draw a conclusion about what's frequent,
right,
and what's common, and what's correlated.
Yep.
But it's not necessarily clear, maybe I'm missing it, how you decide whether or not these different relationships, these different contractual structures resulted in something good, like a marketed product.
Right. Yeah. No, I think I would say I don't know if it can supply that kind of answer. And what I'm trying to do is not go that direction at all, right? Because one thing you could do is sort of say, okay, this is the pattern we see. Most companies want X or Y. Let's do that. Let's create a policy that does X or Y. And I'm really saying let's not think of it that way, because it's most likely that the companies are going to want X, Y, or Z, depending on different combinations. And let's not ask ourselves what X, Y, or Z should be if there's a single one we should choose. Let's try to reduce the costs of the companies in selecting among them. If that, in the sense when I say reduce the cost, what I mean is what we don't want is a policy that forces them into a single path, which I think is what existing scholarship does, which I don't.
Mm-hmm. There's a normative thrust to existing scholarship that pushes them in one direction or another.
Yes, and it's all almost, no, I shouldn't say that. It's really, this really gets to the contract interpretation principles, and the law and econ folks say, formalist interpretation, UCC is bad, for example, and then there are some who argue otherwise. And one way to understand this slide is like, no, like we can't take absolute positions on either of those. It really depends on that mix of exchange hazards. I don't know if that answered your question satisfactorily.
It seems like you're drawing a conclusion that allowing that flexibility is good, right? That it results in some positive gain for what if you could measure effectiveness as, product to market of some kind.
Right.
And all of the ones that resulted in product to market were ones with formal contracts, and none of the ones that were less formal, resulted in a product to market. And I have no idea, whether that's true, but it would seem like to draw that first bullet point, effective governance requires disruption, not just stability. I don't know how we reach that sort of normative conclusion.
Yeah. No, I see what you're saying. I guess, so yeah, I guess my conclusion after puzzling over this was I don't know how to control for like the actual science.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So we could do something like, I don't even know how you'd get enough, I don't know how you get a large N sample, but yeah, maybe if you looked at a single indication and then you looked at just a cluster of companies developing drugs for that, and maybe.
Well, you could do it across the board, right? I mean, assume stochastically that like every molecule, every compound has a equal chance of being successful. So maybe, on average, when the pharma is not interfering and meddling and overseeing and having to approve every step the biotech takes, maybe biotech's more nimble, and you could draw a story like this, right? Nimble and able to explore what they want to do and are successful more often in coming up with something useful. Or, you could draw the other narrative where it's only the biotechs that have good, strong partnerships with pharmas that are very involved and hands-on that succeed in this way.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if, like, what if we looked at, so development backed by a VC as opposed to pharma backers, would that, because the VC companies aren't.
Right, they're totally hands-off.
They might take some board seats and, I bet, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I bet there should be work on that. Oh, yeah, I'll check that. Yeah. Is it, Leslie?
Yeah, so I've got a question about the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah.
And, I'll put it, so a crude concern, and it's sort of related to George's question, but the crude concern is that drug prices are way too high.
Right.
Another crude concern is that there's just all this fighting about intellectual property, and fights about intellectual property are bad for what we might ultimately get about good drugs. Mm-hmm. And also super overprotectiveness of intellectual property is really bad because it's going to drive drug prices up. This is sort of a crude consumer idea.
Yeah.
And so I just wonder whether you've got anything to say about whether any of this, like whether the presence of a governance committee, whether anything you've learned about the structure of the industry can give us any insights about some of those more general problems.
That's a great question. So I think what this brings to light is an underlying assumption of the project is really, this is very much a transaction cost economics story, and it's not an industrial organization story. And by that I just mean if drug prices are driven in part by anti-competitive behavior, this doesn't have anything to say about it. Mm-hmm. If drug prices are, as you say, driven in part just by we're just worried about the IP ownership and all of the complexities of that, yeah, then this would suggest that perhaps, these are transaction costs that are ultimately increasing pharmaceutical prices. I don't know. I'm not that much of a pharma scholar to say for sure, but I suspect the anti-competitive behavior angle has. Well, I don't want to. You can gain a monopoly perfectly legally, right? Just providing an awesome drug, and you get that. But that market power is what explains the price increases. So that's, yeah. Were there other thoughts?
Folks, feel free to ask just if there are things you kind of want to know about contracting or anything. Yeah.
Okay.
How many student hours did you use, and how can I make my students work as well?
I don't know how many.
Don't lie. You know.
I know. I really don't know like the number, but this involved a team of about I don't know the hours number, but this was a team of. Well, I guess I named them all on the contract in the paper.
You know your students' names.
Well, but it's at least a dozen students, and they're probably doing, on average, 10 hours a week in the summer, and it was over 2 summers. And a lot of the data collected isn't reflected in the paper, right? Like there's just hordes of stuff that we didn't find relationships, that sort of thing. Yeah. But you have to love them. That's how you get them involved. So I don't know. I can give you guys a couple of thoughts to all you students, right? So I was a transactional lawyer. I didn't do much of these, frankly, at all. I did some Novartis deals like this, and some semiconductor deals that feel sort of similar. But mostly I did M&A work. If there's anything I would share to you guys, right? I mean, because look, perfectly honestly, I was in your shoes once. I saw this sort of research. I was like, what in the world? Who cares about this? Like regression models, holy crap. Why does this matter? Well, in a way, what we're trying to capture is just the business behavior that you have to master to add value for your clients, right? So it does it in a very technical way, and it's quite dry, and you're like, oh my gosh. But in a very real sense, this is the sort of patterns you're trying to pick up in practice, right? Anybody, well, not anybody, but a lot of people can take a template agreement, do a few deals and kind of get a sense, oh, this is what we do, right? You get feedback from your partner. I know how to write an indemnity, or I know how to write, this sort of provision or that sort of provision. But your ability to understand your client's business and what their pain points are and what their opportunities are, and to translate that into a deal, that's the magic that they pay you for. That's what makes the difference between an associate and a partner. And in a way, that's what the paper is looking at in a very abstract way. You build this over time sort of tacitly as a lawyer. But that's just sort of a call to, yeah, maybe you don't want to run regressions the rest of your life. Maybe you do, that'd be great, but you don't have to. But at the very least, you want to try to sort of just informally trace these regressions in your practice. You can see what clients want when do they need these sort of things. That's it. So take Kathy's deals course.
Well, and I'd add to that, this is a fantastic paper and a fantastic project. And, I think even as lawyers in the trenches doing these types of deals, lawyers often don't have a broad enough industry view. Right? This is fabulous because it's a view of an entire industry, an entire category of deals. And, not every lawyer, and I include myself, is going to, understand all of the stats behind a paper like this. But I think every lawyer doing these types of deals should try to, read as much as they can of a paper like this. And because it gives it helps improve your intuition of this industry. That is a very complex industry. And usually, you work for 3 or 4 or 5 different clients to sort of know what their business is, but there are not that many reference works or not that many sources where you get a really nice overview of an industry, how it works and how it's interconnected. So this is great. All lawyers should read this.
Yeah. The other thing I'll say, because I imagine a lot of you are focused on IP. I didn't have enough circles on that second slide to really show it, but really one of the big points of the paper is to take the IP literature and drop it into the relational contracting literature. And most relational contracting scholars have never read the IP literature, even though. Well, I'll just share this story at the end. One thing that got me onto this paper was simply in practice, I started to look at the lawyers that were involved in these deals, and they were all in the IP transactions groups at major firms. That's usually how the firms refer to them. And it just made me think, oh, maybe these are IP deals. They're not sort of the classic relational contracting thing. So it's very much like a, two thumbs up to the IP scholarship that provides the foundation for this. So,
Thank you.
thanks, guys. It was fun.
Please hang around for further conversation and food, which will be